Continuing on with our broadcast of a live permaculture design course that's been put on by Mike Hoag of Transformative Adventures. My mistake. Let me put up the caption for that one too, in fact. So there you go. There's the website. Go check out more about it. So we're going to be listening in on a Zoom call. And tonight the topic is going to be swales and I suppose other sorts of earthworks, ways of shaping the land. I need to go eat dinner, so I'm not going to be right at my computer for most of the beginning of the class here. But I will be following along on my phone. So if you have any questions or anything, feel free to ask, and I'll answer them or relay them to Mike, whoever the question is directed to. Anyway, let's see if we can start the broadcast. Should be able to bring it up in just a second here. So as soon as Mike lets me into the meeting, looks like I'm getting in, and I'll be putting it up on the screen. And so I am muted for the Zoom class, but not for you guys. So don't worry about, if you ask a question, don't worry about having me answer it directly. I'm not interrupting any part of the class, but let's bring it up on screen right now. And we will go to, is this the right one? Nope, that's not the right one. Oh, my mistake. We're doing entire screen, of course. Picking that one. So it's going to be awkward for just a second here as we set up the meeting.
Hello, everyone. Well, it looks like so far just Joey and Zach. I'm sure others are going to join us in just a minute and we'll get started. Give me just a couple minutes to make sure people are joining us and get my worksheets and stuff ready here. And then we'll get started in just about 1 minute.
Recording in progress. Recording in progress.
Well, hello. Now we're on to class 7 of our 2022 Permaculture Design Certificate course and Landscape Transformation program. And today we're going to be doing one of the big topics of permaculture, which is, of course, water-wise design and adventures that'll help make your landscape be irrigation proof. And so a lot of these techniques are pretty amazing. They really do work well when you use them and stack them together and create a nice system out of them. And because of that, it was for the last 10 years or so, it's been very rare for me to have to ever water my garden. And that's in what was a relatively dry climate, right on the edge of the 30 inches line, pushing making a fairly dry climate. And through a couple of the biggest droughts that we've had in the last we had a couple of the largest droughts that we've had since the Dust Bowl age. And even in those years, because of those techniques, even with a large garden, I had to do no irrigation other than watering in some seedlings. And the reason or the way that is all possible is because of these really cool kinds of permaculture water design features and stacking them all together. And I know at least one person on this call already has done a lot of these too, and has had a very similar kind of experience. So these really are powerful techniques, especially when we stack them all together. And with climate change coming up, we know that, like I said, where I was living, we had the two largest droughts that we've had in like 100 years. And we had 200-year events, like within 5 years when it came to droughts. So that's of course the reality for us looking into a climate change future, is that it's not just going to be getting warmer, it's going to be becoming a lot more chaotic in general. These kinds of techniques that allow us to garden and to do so without having to irrigate are really powerful. So I look forward to chatting about all these today. And just as a reminder, last time we talked about microclimate design. If you're kind of following along in our textbook, my book, Beauty and Abundance, then you'll notice that in that book, I combine these two together into one of our preliminary design steps, so that as we are thinking about the landscape, we can start thinking about all our water resources and how we're using water, and think about all those microclimate factors. So today, we're going to go through some of the water design stuff, and then we're going to kind of workshop and do some examples today. But on Wednesday, we're going to come back and really talk about applying this in our landscapes and helping other people apply to theirs. So we're really going to workshop it on Wednesday. And that's when we're going to come back and finish up talking about the microclimate design too, because I know we didn't quite get through all that. So we're going to double out those up on Wednesday and kind of take a little bit of a relaxed pace on Wednesday and focus on just those two topics. So today's class, we're going to start out, we're going to say hi. Let's say hi and see how everyone's doing here for a little bit. And then in the first hour or so, we're going to go through patterns and adventures for water-wise gardening. Then in the second half of the class, or the second hour, we're going to look at some videos and look at some really cool stuff to watch how water actually moves in the soil and in the landscapes, because it's really informing. It's really transformative to understand better how landscape hydrology works. It can really change the way we plan water features in the garden. And then in the third hour, or what's left of it, we're going to use the handy dandy swale and water catchment calculator app that's in the folder. I think everyone who's on here has access to those, or everyone who will be on here has access to those. If you're watching this on Zach's channel and you get a knack for this and you decide you want to join, please let us know, let him know, let us know, and we'll figure out how to make that happen. So that swale calculator is really cool, because in the last 10, 15 years, as we've had more permaculturists doing lots of swales, or a lot of excitement about the concept of swales, we've been seeing more and more kind of swale fails. I was just in New York and talking about a major project there that was really well funded, and a major permaculture figure came and designed a swale system, and the swale system actually caused a lot of it wasn't it was just done using rule of thumb and kind of eyeballing it and seeing how it feels, and really got the math very wrong, to the point where it actually caused really high mortality of the trees they planted. So they had like 80-90% mortality of their tree crops in a fairly wet climate where water usually isn't even an issue. So, there are lots of stories coming out, behind the scenes about swales blowing out and swales destroying the landscape hydrology, and instead of hydrating the landscape, creating deserts and things like that. So, so the swale calculator is pretty cool because it's designed to do all that math for us. So we actually get the math right, and won't have problems like that. And I was looking at it today. I'm playing around with it, and in one of the last classes we were talking about fractals and fractal geometry, and the swale calculator, as we'll see in that last hour, actually uses some pretty cool fractal geometry to do the swale math right. So it's kind of a fun, hey, actual application of these nature patterns. So that's what we have in store for us today. Anyone feel like saying hi and checking in and on anything before we continue on? Before we jump to things, how y'all doing? I'll also say too, just a reminder, I know it appears that like more than half of the class this time is actually taking this class largely by watching the recorded videos and kind of checking in from time to time. So this is just a reminder, if you ever have questions about these topics as they're coming up, if you get me those questions, I can make sure to discuss those topics in the classes. Which makes this a good time too. If any of y'all who are actually on here live have any questions or thoughts about water design features and these topics today, any comments you want to bring into the discussion before we get started?
I'll say hi.
Hi. Glad to see your face.
Hi. Yeah, I'm excited about this topic. We've over time been mitigating flooding in our yard, and we have a small pond now that also serves a little bit as a rain garden on one side. Last year we attached rain barrels. I want to ask about the winterization of that, because the barrels came with instructions not to leave them full of water over the winter. So that just presented like some extra labor emptying them out and sort of defeating a little bit some of the purpose. And now we've got to figure out when to reconnect them, when it's not going to freeze anymore, but we're still going to capture a lot of the spring rains. So it feels kind of labor intensive. I don't know if we could cover it or something, or, to not have to empty them out. Yeah, so I think this is a great topic. Also, I posted recently in the group, just kind of jumping off an article that I saw that was telling the history of snowplows and kind of what we've done with snow, right? So when we used to go around in horse and buggy, then we just needed to compact the snow, not move it or get rid of it. And it just got me thinking system-wise, because we may be in need of replacing our driveway sometime in the next couple of years. And I've been trying to look at permeable materials and things like that. And anyways, this article got me thinking about also how to do snow differently, right? Because I'm in Chicago. There's so much that is cleared. There's so much that gets filthy dirty with car pollution and with salt. We sometimes do have to salt because it gets icy on our driveway or walk, but we use the kind that is safer for pets and lawns. But still realizing that's not a great thing to be doing, and just trying to imagine, not going backwards. I doubt we're going to be riding around with horse and buggy, but what our vehicles of the future look like, and what our roads look like where we're not moving snow and putting chemicals down and all of that. Just sort of how do we change that system? So that's just a glimpse into all of the thoughts I'm having as we tackle water.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Snow really is water in an unusual form, isn't it? And something that's really difficult to manage in some ways. I hear someone else maybe about to speak up, have something to add. Oh, I guess not. So Yeah, and this other issue with rain barrels is a really common one too, and this gives us today. I'm going to be using Jason Podvork's version of this of our permaculture water curriculum. So for Transformative Adventures over the last 7 or 8 years, we've kind of been retooling some of the permaculture water curriculum, keeping all of the original great stuff and kind of just reworking it and making things maybe a little bit more practical. And he took a lot of my stuff and stuff that we've done as a group and turned it into this really cool thing that's really easy to manage, which is waters. So we'll be using this handy educational framework of waters to think about how to deal with waters. Boy, he's clever. I love it. And so one of the things that we used to say is that water direction over water collection, and which is kind of what you were bringing up, Melanie. I've had exactly the same experience too. And we're always going to take this yes and approach to things. And what I like to say is that rain barrels are really awesome because one, they're, you can paint them, they're really visible to people, and what they really do is they telegraph and they show that we are valuing water and that we're treating it as a resource to be harvested and used responsibly instead of just letting it become something destructive. So part of the real value of rain barrels is kind of their symbolic value, but the most important part of our rain barrels isn't the water that they hold in them. It's the opportunity to direct the water that goes out of the overflow spout. So we have to make sure we have a nice big 2-inch overflow port so that we're actually able to send that overflow water where we want it to go. Then we route that into the real best place to store water, which is kind of in the soil, and in the gardens. And because our soil can practically speaking, if we can get the water into it, in most cases, in most of our yards, the soil and plant communities there can catch and store and hold all the water that's falling on them. They generally have that capacity. So the trick is getting them there, and the rain barrel as infrastructure can be really helpful to do that. But I found the same thing with mine, that they're kind of burdensome for the amount of time and effort it takes. And then think about it for a second. When you harvest water in the rain barrel, they can't be out during the wet season, during the winter. So still you can have that overflow routed so that you're still directing the water. You don't actually have to run it into the rain barrel in order to use that pipe system to direct the water into rain garden. So then you put out the rain barrel, and through the wet season, it's always full. So it's never filling up more, Through the wet season, the rain barrels are full and you don't need the water. Then when the dry season comes, if we have an extended dry season, the rain barrels are empty when we need the water. Hopefully they'll hold some water, so they are somewhat practical. But in a large garden, a few rain barrels really is not a ton of water. So, but they're still great, and they do hold some practical water, and they also have a powerful symbolic effect. So you and I, it sounds like, have come to very similar conclusions about that they're really cool and they're great, but they also seem like a lot of weird work and not as practical as they may seem. Seem about right to you?
Yeah, and I mean, don't get me wrong. We actually have been really happy using them, and when they are full of water, when we get a big rain and then we peek inside and we're like, yes, it's full. We've got three full barrels, and it's so exciting because we can use that for watering. And it also helped prevent some of the flooding in our yard, just to collect that extra water at the time, because our system is set up where at least we're not dumping our water into like the main city connection. That's not allowed where I am. But we have under our patio, there's a manhole cover, and if you lift it up, it's where our laundry, our gray water from laundry goes, and from the kitchen sink, and then also this one side, that's where the gutters go. And so if that gets really full, then the ground also gets really soggy, because that's where it's leaching into the ground. And so it was part of the flooding issue. So, we love them, but yes, there's some upkeep, and it's not everything, right? But they are. I love what you said too about it's a great entry point for some people, because they're right on our patio, and certainly if we have people over and they're like, "What's that?" It's like an easy way to start talking about some of this stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just to add one more thing to that, I kind of like to make the point that they're not the end of it, right? You said it perfectly. They're not the end of it. But like for my gardens, even in the droughty years, I think you may have missed it at the beginning. I was saying, because of stacking all of these water-wise features together with the garden, I never had to do like irrigation, even with like 2 months of drought. The garden simply did not require that, because of all of these other features and because of routing the water and all that. So, but what I did do, and I always have to, is I water in seedlings. When I plant seedlings and I plant new starts of things, I water them in. Well, that wet season is the time when the rain barrels are always full, so I can use that great rainwater to water in my seedlings and never have to touch tap water. So yeah, and that way they actually are pretty practical, but they're full of water during the wet season, because you still do need to have some water during the wet season. So they have uses.
Yeah, and even if we have also not had to use tap water in that, but as we've looked at different systems and things we might want to do with water, if you did have to leave a large amount of tap water out to get the chlorine out of it, or just to make it healthier to use for watering, you could use a rain barrel. And we have someone in our community who's done something really cool with the rain barrel. We haven't gotten this sophisticated yet, but he's got a raised bed that is lined with something so the water can't get through it, and then it's full of pebbles, and he's growing things in like burlap bags and things like that. But he's got he rigged a toilet float to tell the system when it needs some watering, and so he draws from the rain barrel, and it just self-waters. It's pretty ingenious. We're like, okay, we're all about how to not walk around the garden having to water less. So
yeah, those are really cool systems. They're called ball valves. So anybody who heard about that and is thinking about doing it, you can make ball valves as first flush diverters for your rain barrel system too. So with a similar thing, you can put a ball valve in a bit of PVC pipe like that, so it's a floating valve, and your downspout can go into here. I'll actually draw this. I think I used to have. I think in one of the future presentations, I have a diagram of this. But since it came up and it's totally relevant, I would like to take 5 seconds to kind of show it. So here's the downspout from your house, right? And you hook up your rain barrel, and when you hook up, why isn't this working? Okay, 1 second. I seem to be having an issue. Well, there it goes. Okay. So as you hook up your rain barrel, here's the rain barrel. You also have, this wasn't working for a second, so this is pretty awkward. So that goes to the rain barrel. And you also have a second thing here, which is like a PVC pipe. So the PVC pipe has a ball valve like you just described. So it's only when the PVC fills up that the ball valve hits to this, and then the water flows through and goes into the rain barrel. So that means that if there's any pollutants on the roof, or if there are any loose asphalt, shingle material, or anything like that, all of that goes into this first and diverts that first flush of pollution, so you're not putting it in the garden. So that's a pretty neat system. And then all you have to do, of course, is this has a bottom on it. So you take off the bottom to clean it out after a big rain. And just, every once in a while you clean that out. And then it just it improves the quality of the rainwater we're collecting. So that that's one step. That's the ball valve type of first flush diverter. And our original system at Lily House had those, but I'll be honest, I often didn't put them out. And the reason why was because the overflow and everything in the rain barrel then went into a second filter system, which was kind of a little biofilter system before it went into swales that fed the garden. I have a diagram of this a little bit later. And so eventually I just kind of felt like I was never using those rain barrels directly, so I would basically just kind of let them flow into here. And so I kind of got to the point where I didn't feel like the first flush diverters were necessary in my system, but it's still a really cool trick. You mentioned another thing too, which was this thing. You mentioned a wicking bed, and these are really handy as a way of collecting water as well. We'll talk about those a bit. But that's a kind of thing where we make a bed that basically waters itself. And we like to talk about ways to make gardening really, really easy. If you make a bed that waters itself and has a ball valve diverter like that, so it just, whenever the bed gets thirsty, it waters itself. I mean, you can't get much easier than a garden than that. Then you have nice deep mulch in it, so you never have to weed. It has great fertility. You can put a worm tube in there, so you have a wicking worm bed. It has all the fertility built, the fertilizer built in. It's completely weed free, and it waters itself. You can't get easier than that. Game over, it's done, free vegetables. One of my clients did this in their driveway. They had like 2 driveways, and they didn't feel like they could like jackhammer out the whole second driveway. They built a bunch of beds like this right in their driveway. So pretty cool. Okay, well, awesome. I love when things like this just kind of come up in conversation. Let's go back here. Well, let's talk about this Jason's waters concept a little bit here. I love this too. Visualize the view from a raindrop as it falls through a dark cloud into the open sky above a forest, rolling off a leaf and down a root deep into living soil, flowing through the earth till it bubbles up from a quiet valley spring, fostering life through creek, stream, and river to the sea. So water is life. Understanding how waters come, linger, and leave is crucial to growing an ecologically healthy garden. Wise planning can minimize or eliminate the irrigation we need to do, and at the same time boost the resilience and autonomy of the garden. So the first thing is what we were just talking about. Get water where it matters most. So this is, like I used to say, we used to say this: water direction over water collection. Send the water and get the water to where it's going to be a resource instead of a problem. Area is the A, and this stands for making sure that the plants have the area that they need, that they have the correct spacing. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but this actually means 2 different things. It means that this is kind of a pretty cutting edge or advanced gardening concept. It means that in in the wet season and through most of the season, we want nice, dense plantings where plants get just exactly the amount of space they need to thrive, which means they're not quite touching each other. They're never overcrowded. And we thin things if we need to make sure they're not overcrowded. You know, overcrowded gardens are just never going to be very productive. We want to make sure things have the space they need, but they don't need as much space as most conventional gardens give them, you know? So we want to have almost complete covering of the soil. It's ironic. It seems like if you've got 3 times as many plants, those three times extra plants would use 3 times the amount of water, right? But it turns out they're actually kind of cooperate together in terms of shading the soil and creating microclimate. And the denser plantings actually use less soil than if we have big open areas for paths with just narrow rows of plants. So having big beds with dense plantings is really great, except for one occasion, when it starts to get really droughty. If the soil has depleted all of its soil moisture, all of the extra plants can't really work together to conserve soil moisture because there is no soil moisture. So that's the time when we want to really open up spacing. So my protocol over the last, and this is a pretty common thing in some like really cutting edge bio-intensive gardening and dry gardening systems. In the wet season, when there's water, and most of the time you use dense plantings. If it gets droughty, then I harvest 90% of everything that I can. It's going to die anyway if there's a drought, right? And then leave just the things at pretty wide open spacing. Things that are really drought tolerant, like tomatoes and peppers, we can leave those and then use lots of deep mulch and have very wide spacings. So we kind of have, so the A in areas stands for 2 different techniques. It means most of the time we're using dense plantings, but if water becomes rare, then we prioritize and we pull the things that, leave the things that we want and pull the other things and conserve water that way. So, that's a great strategy. The T is for thick mulch, because thick mulch in a whole lot of university studies and agricultural studies have been found to pretty much completely reduce or even eliminate irrigation of gardens and farm areas in a whole lot of cases. Just in general, even a small layer of mulch, just a 2-inch layer of mulch, can eliminate water loss from the system, evaporation from the soil by more than 1/3. So you can see how using lots of mulch can end up completely eliminating the need to irrigate in a lot of cases. The E is for ecology. Later on tonight, we're going to talk about how ecosystems can help us infiltrate water. And then the R is for reshaping. These are these things that we always talk about, like our ponds and swales and all these things, but they're intensive, so we need to use them very wisely. And finally, S is for soil is the last word, because healthy soil is the most important thing when it comes to water and water catchment and using water effectively. It can both make sure that the water gets into the soil, and soil with a lot of carbon and life in it can hold practically a small lake underneath the ground. So it can really make a huge difference in terms of how water is used. I think later on in one of the handouts, I'll actually have some statistics on that. So that's why we always do this. I mean, if you can see with great soil texture and lots of carbon, the water will just tend to really soak into really good soil. So any thoughts or comments about that before we carry on? But we're going to start with this idea of where, the W in water. Get water where it can help us the most. So we're going to go over some permaculture tools and techniques. Step one in this is when we start to look at a property, we need to analyze where is the water, where are the water resources, and where does it need to go? It's pretty simple, pretty logical kind of thing, except that most of us never do it. Most of us just think, well, this is the spot where the people who built the house had the garden, so that's where the garden is. And we never tend to think about things like whether or not that makes any sense, or whether or not it has water resources, or how we get water resources to it. So we start by actually thinking about that. This is a more modern version of a contour or elevation map, and it's for the project that I'm developing right now. And so it's just one of the things we want to look at is to find like elevation maps of whatever sites we're looking at. A lot of times you can find them on by searching for GIS and your county name. So if you're in Tompkins County, you could search for Tompkins County GIS, or if you're in Allen County, it could be Allen County GIS, which stands for Geographical Information Systems. And often they will have some sort of contour maps in those systems that you can find and print them off. So this is in particular the site that I'm developing. You can see it's got a house here, and it has two structures, a garage and an old carriage house on it. The driveway to the right there. What do you think? What are even on a site like this, are there water resources? What would be the water resources in a site like this? Anyone have ideas? There's no like river running through it or spring. Are there water resources on the site? A big thing here will always be any impervious areas, all the impervious areas. Yeah. All the impervious areas are the big water resources that we have the potential to take advantage of. This site, generally speaking, slopes very slightly, but it does slope in this kind of direction. So things generally run this way. And of course, this is north, just to give you all an idea. Of course, it's in the northern hemisphere, so the sun goes across the sky to the south. So with that, seeing where some of these water resources are, I was thinking out loud, you might be thinking with me. It looks like some major areas for potential development are, right here. This is in the middle of a lot of water resources. And this area down here is all very sunny. I see lots of trees, but this looks like a nice sunny area, maybe through here. And it looks like there are multiple good water resources right here too. And of course, the house has plumbing and things, as Melanie was talking about earlier. So, we might be able to also route water in from one direction or another from the plumbing in some ways too. So those look like some pretty great water resources. And it looks like too, being to the south, this one here next to the house looks like a great zone 1 garden. I'll kind of shade that in. And this over here looks like the biggest sunny area. So it looks really great that we have those two big water resources and that the whole property kind of shifts in that direction. With that, it looks like a lot of the property, like a lot of this up here, maybe up here too is another good one, right? This area, it's going to be shady. Oops, I'll do these in red. It looks like it's going to be shady, but it looks like some grass. So that looks like it, has good access to water resources. But there's a lot of the property that looks like you know, it's not going to have great access to water. Anyone else have anything to mention? Any other ideas here about water resources on this property? This look about right?
Yeah, that looks right. One of the things that I would look at a property is are there existing gutters or not? Because sort of changes, like we've got gutters on the house, but not on the garage, right? And we've had the conversation of should we put gutters on the garage to collect that water, and what will be the impact of the plants that already get watered from the roof directly? So that's a question I would have about the buildings that you have there. Are they all with gutters or that? And then the other thing that occurs to me is just neighbors, what's going on in neighbors' yards. And again, just jumping off our own situation, some of our flooding was exacerbated when a neighbor changed the level of their yard. You know, they brought in a bunch of dirt and didn't really pull up the watershed map and decide to honor that. And so our flooding got worse. So I would wonder what's going on in adjacent properties as well.
Yeah, yeah, good points. You know, for the record, so far it doesn't appear much because, you know, there are driveways in between on both sides, and the properties flow, you know, all towards this back here, which is an alley. So, you know, most of the water problem, if there, to the extent there is one, accumulates in the alley, which is something to be mindful of and think about, because it can and has potentially caused problems. And maybe this is something that we could talk together about with the neighbors and say, you know, are you all tired of having the alley there have a problem? And maybe it's something that we can solve with some permaculture and with our yards, because, you know, the city's never going to solve that. So yeah. And Zach mentioned the idea of potentially collecting things like dew and fog. We're actually going to talk about some techniques like that later on tonight. And with all of the other water resources around here, oh, and you mentioned gutters. No, there were not gutters on the house, and that's one of the very first things that I did for exactly that reason, because water direction is, you know, basically starts at gutters and also a healthy foundation for your house. So that was definitely one of the first things that happened on this house. But especially Zach, up here in this area, right? You know, it looks like there's not, other than this, there's a sidewalk up here. Maybe I can take some of the water from the sidewalk too. Otherwise, this area is all looking like it's going to be dependent on me carrying water buckets if I'm planting water, things that require it, or our other strategy, you know, without the water, you know, potentially trying to harvest things like dew and stuff like that, especially important in very dry climates. Then the other strategy is simply to plant things that are extremely hardy and drought tolerant and will not ever require much water in those areas, right? So you can kind of see here that this is the idea. It comes down to this zones issue again, that we're gonna, you know, the things that require a lot of water, you plant them in the places that have a lot of water resources, right? And that you can direct a lot of water to. And then in the areas where, if you want an easy life, if you don't want to be carrying around buckets of water, then in the places where you don't have these water resources and you can't passively irrigate or just, you know, have a downspout go to it, that's where we're doing plants that really can thrive without water. And then we're using lots of deep mulch. And maybe there are some other things that we can do. We'll see here as some techniques to make sure to try to get some water where we want it. Yeah. All right. Well, that was kind of anyone else have anything else to add to this before we kind of carry on? We'll come back and talk about some more ideas. So this gives us another, I'm going to fast forward just a second because we mentioned zones. So again, with our number one strategy for reducing our irrigation need and using water well in the landscape, is this idea of zones again. You know, up close to the house where we automatically have a big water resource, you plant the things that need that water. And then as you move away from the house, we start planting things that are very drought tolerant, that aren't going to need water. This is probably the biggest thing that can save us from having to do a lot of water labor. And you know, certainly I have seen and visited a whole lot of gardens that have honestly failed because there was not water resources, or there were not water resources at all, and people were still planting things like lettuces and cabbages and broccoli and things that require a lot of water. You know, it's a recipe for a garden to not be very happy, or for a gardener to not be happy and to be carrying around a lot of water. So this idea of planting, of getting the water where it needs to go, and also getting the plants where you have the water. These are kind of, you know, it's kind of our number one strategy. So with that, I'm just checking in on the chat real quick, make sure I didn't miss anything. With that, we have one big, kind of most important calculation for managing water for the garden for anywhere in the world. And this is based on the idea that how much water does it take to grow standard vegetable garden crops? And we have plenty of plants that can be quite drought tolerant, but how much water does it take to grow your standard garden crops? And of course, the answer is already on here for you. It's about an inch per week through the growing season. If the soil is good and it's not too hot, it's about an inch per week. And especially if you have lots of mulch, it could be much less than that. But so on average, you know, just about an inch per week through the growing season. So our basic calculation is, you know, how many inches of rain do you have? And how many weeks are there in the growing season? So for example, going back here, if I'm looking at the lovely water resource, and I want to turn this into my major like production zone 3 garden, I see I have water here and I have water here. So, you know, you want to know about how many inches you have over the course of the year. In this location, to be honest, here it's pretty darn good. It's about 38 inches. If this were in Kalamazoo, it'd be about 30 inches, right on the edge. Well, let's say this was in Nebraska, and you only had 10 inches of rain per year, and you were in a dry climate. You have 10 inches of rain per year. And I want to be able to passively irrigate this and not have to spend a lot of time watering it. You know, this shows me already, if I plant a garden and it requires 1 inch a week, and let's say the growing season is, you know, in Nebraska, it's pretty cold. It's probably, you know, April, May, June, July, August, September, October. You know, so about that, you know, let's say 6 months times 4, you know, so let's say on average, maybe about 30 weeks. So you can start to see why the number 30 inches of rain is very important. If you have approximately a 30-inch growing season or a 30-week growing season, then you need 1 inch of water per week. That gets you there. If you only have 10 inches, well, that's tough to have a garden without water. Except you have this area right here, and I'll do these in yellow so you can tell what I'm talking about. You have this area here. Oh, I said yellow. You have this area here, and this area here, and maybe this area here. So, you know, let's say total, these make 1,000 square feet of catchment area. You know, I can divide that by 3, you know, and say 300 square feet or something like that. Now, if I make a garden that's 300 square feet, and I'm sending water to it from 1,000 square feet, if I can hold that water in the soil and keep it there and make sure it's conserved well, and I'm gardening really well, I should be able to garden now with good soil that holds water and lots of deep mulch and maybe some appropriate shade. I should be able to get that, you know, hold that soil, hold that 1 inch of water use per week through the 30 inches or through the 30 weeks of the growing season there in the soil. So this is kind of the universal calculation we're always doing. You know, if you're in a region where you're on average really having 40 inches of rain per season, if your soil is good and it's actually, the water's actually getting into the soil, and there's not like a long period of drought or something, water usually isn't a problem, right? We have enough water to always have a really good garden. So this is kind of the big water calculation. Does that make sense? Anyone have any thoughts or questions or comments or concerns about that? It's an idea. There's even been some research on like Mediterranean climates. Even in Mediterranean, and Toby Hemingway mentions this in Gaia's Garden. In Mediterranean climates, you can, you know, they may have like 60 inches of rain per season, but it's all during the time of year when you don't grow plants. You get 60 inches of precipitation, but then you have, you know, 6 months or, you know, 5 months or something of drought where there's no water. Even in those situations, if we have rich soil and we have good plantings and we have deep mulch and all this, we can get through the growing season without irrigating with the right crops off of the wet season in the winter. So that's kind of some magic there, that's actually been confirmed. So long as we can do it, then we can build these gardens that really don't require much irrigation at all. All right. Feel free to ask any questions or comments before I move on. Okay. Let's see. Moving along, and just to show another little technique here for getting water where it wants to grow. Here's a driveway, and this is, you know, planting at Lily House. It's basically a rain garden that also has a lot of food plants in it. Things like skirt, which I think you can kind of, maybe you can't see the skirt quite in this picture, but skirt is basically a wetland plant. That's, oh yeah, you can, I think right there maybe. Oh, I'll ask in a second. So here, you know, there are little indentations, little basins, so that the water trickles along the side here and then goes in to into the garden, into little basins that will infiltrate the water. So, you know, just very passively, we can always try to catch some of these ideas and make them work. About frost pockets from rain gardens and swales. That's a really great question. And in fact, in the last class, we were talking about microclimates. Hey, somebody speak up and remind me. In a few seconds, we're going to talk about swales. And this is a really important concept or thing to talk about with swales, because in first we'll talk about what swales are. So let me answer this question when we get to swales, but thank you for asking. It's a great question. I'll make sure I try to cover it. Okay. Which brings us to, oh sheesh, I got scribbles on there, which brings us to kind of a great question. So if you feel like chipping in here and you want to say hello and unmute yourself for a second or throw something in the chat, you can join in. What are some of, somebody just mentioned swales and rain gardens. What are some of the types of water harvesting features that that we can use in our gardens? Let's add those. feel free to just speak up. You don't need to raise your hand because I can't see you right now anyway. Uh-huh. Rain gardens. Things like rain gardens, I would call all of those, that's a better color. I would call all of those forms of, the technical name is infiltration basins. Infiltration basins. You know, so a rain garden, the whole idea of it is that we're trying to collect the water and get it infiltrated into the soil and back into aquifers. And they can be really powerful for growing better gardens too. So, yeah, I just always like to check in briefly on some of these sorts of things. Here are some of them, some of the main types of them that we'll be using or talking about tonight. Of course, we always have like man-made things like cisterns and rain barrels as one form of catchment. But these are all different types of catchments too. So infiltration basins like rain gardens, contour plowing. This is where we plow, but we put the plows on contour so the water actually goes into them instead of flowing downhill or something. We'll see some examples of this in a minute, so it becomes clear what I'm talking about. I'll explain all of these. Passive swales. Passive swale is a term that Bill Mollison used at least once or twice in a few of his talks. And this is a way we can make swales without any kind of digging, if you know what a swale is. So swales just magically appear all by themselves. Technical term for this is LEVs. So swales, terraces, and forests and other ecosystems are all some major ways that we can harvest water that we'll talk about real quick in this talk before we take a break. So just to kind of get into a few of these before we take a break. This is a classic idea of an infiltration basin, and it basically looks like a rain garden, right? The basic idea of it is we have a basin, and maybe you have a downspout, or you have a sink like this, and the water is routed so that it fills up this basin and soaks down into the soil. This is a classic design called a banana circle, which uses the fertility of gray water and the water, because bananas like a lot of fertility and a lot of water. So this classic banana circle is a great idea for using an infiltration basin. Then the magic is that this infiltration basin will also soak the soil, and the water will kind of move through here too. So we can, all of this around here, these edges all become a great opportunity for growing gardens next to the banana circle, next to this infiltration basin. So this is something that we can do on every property. One of the questions that people often ask me are, or people always see the lily house diagram, which had things like swales and water direction because it was on a hill. And people will say, man, I wish I was on a hill so I could do that stuff. Well, guess what? It's even easier if you're not on a hill. You being not on a hill, having flat land is actually the best situation, because then the water is more likely to just soak into the soil without running off. We actually have to do less if we're on flatter land. But one thing we can always do are these infiltration basins. So, and then, they can solve two problems, because Melanie was talking about on her site, there's actually a situation where it was bad because of the flooding and a flood potential. Well, You know, we can plan for that too. If there's potentially a flood problem, we can make sure we dig this down really well. And if I can make this work, we can dig this down really well and fill this area kind of with sand so that it becomes what's called a dry well. And the water really soaks down and infiltrates into it. And then these raised areas here and here become really great opportunities for growing things that are dry. And yet we're still doing our ethical job of catching this water and soaking it back down to recharge the aquifers. So we can be very sophisticated about how we design this sort of thing. Here is, again, we've talked about this before. This is classic permaculture design. This is my illustration of it in my book, Beauty and Abundance. And it's built on the idea of an infiltration basin. As it says here, the swale path collects water from your downspout, so it can be hooked up with that overflow like we talked about. The water flows into here, and we have this area dug out. So it's an infiltration basin, and then it's filled with deep mulch. So it's a path that can last a really long time. And then we can inoculate that with wine cap mushrooms. So we have a path that's infiltrating water, that's soaking out water to the vegetables, to the vegetable garden here with deep mulch, so that we create a garden that never needs to be watered, and the path never needs to be maintained or weeded because it's super deep mulch, and it's also growing wine cap mushrooms for us. So no space is even wasted. This is how all the beds at Lily House were designed. So it's or most of the beds, the main production beds. So this is a fantastic pattern that looks a lot like that the banana circle, but it's made to primarily grow annual vegetable gardens. So like we were saying earlier, if you design your garden so that they don't need to be weeded and they don't need to be watered, they have fertility built in and mulch built in, then you have the easiest possible garden you could ever imagine. So a very cool and very practical pattern, and you can do it again anywhere, including on flat land. And this just has a couple of pictures of that. You can see on the right here, the swale system with the rain barrel not there. You can tell this is in the spring. I haven't put the rain barrel out yet in the bottom right, but the water still flows from the downspout into this little basin area. And then there are a series of overflows. So the water flows down through here, which helps filter it. And there's a swale here, a little mini swale. And so the water comes through here and infiltrates. And then right here, there's an infiltration basin. So it's set up so that this fills first, and then it overflows and comes down here and fills up this infiltration basin and waters this entire bed. And when that fills up, it does the same thing and flows down further again. So you can kind of see that setup up here, water into the rain barrel, then into these different little catchments and infiltration basins. So, you know, this is how we could set up these gardens so that they really work and really become gardens that you never need to water. Here's a picture of one of a very similar idea that was created from a very old movie by Jeff Lawton. And this whole area, again, is set up to fill up with water. So, it's routed from a downspout, so it's a little keyhole bed, really nice, easy to use garden. And this water soaks then through all of these rich vegetable beds, which also, here's a worm tube, and there's a worm tube. So they're composting in these beds. This is a garden that has the water built into it right from the downspout, and it has the fertilizer built right into it. So if we build gardens that have fertility built into them and water built into them, it just can't get easier than this. We already talked tonight about using the same exact idea with a wicking bed. So that's that idea. Native Americans used another kind of infiltration basin. These are called waffle gardens. And so these were really common, especially in droughty areas. And as you can see here, the whole idea of these is that the water will fall and concentrate in, you know, one or two areas here, right? And because the waffle effect, they'll be cool and shady. So each one of these collects its own water. And these corners then can become the opportunity to grow your plants. These are not green scribbles. Those are plants, people. So it's a really amazing kind of system, and really common in the Pacific North or Southwest, or in the Southwest, the American Southwest. So these are actual historic shots of them, which you can see some dead hedges in the background. And by doing things like this, Native North Americans and First Peoples here were able to grow crops in places where it's pretty much impossible. They did the impossible. They accomplished the impossible by doing these kinds of water catchment areas. So infiltration basins on this scale are usually most helpful in very dry climates. Now we can do the same thing using the same math we talked about earlier. So on a big scale. So there's a plan now called the 30-40 system that's being used as a best practice by agroecologists around the world. And the idea of this is, again, if you're in a climate where you have a 30-week growing season and you get about 10 inches of rain, you can divide up this thing into a third. And you know, this last section here is going to be the most productive part, right? So you can design the garden in a way that this whole area is catchment area, and you can use plants that are, you know, very stingy with water, parsimonious with water, that don't require watering perhaps at wide spacings, but have it all so that the water really flows into something like an infiltration basin here. So then this one infiltration basin, you're using a big catchment area to grow the water for one area here. And now we can really have a productive garden right here. And this area is not lost, you know, it's still useful for, we're going to make, you know, drought tolerant crops red. So we have less planted here, but we have drought tolerant crops, probably tree crops. So it helps shade it and infiltrate the water. But if we can use this kind of system, then we can, you know, direct and collect the water where it needs to go, even in dry climates, and have great gardens. I think that's pretty much magic right there. So, and next up, we have permaculture's most famous water collection system of all, which is the swale on contour. And whoops. And of course, the idea is the water flows downhill here, flows into the swale. By the way, this is a Bill Mollison illustration of a swale, and it looks fantastic to me. You'll notice it emphasizes this buildup. The soil from here is placed on top fairly loosely. The water soaks in here and continues downhill close to the soil surface, saturating this so that we can establish this tree and these plants down here. Looks like a well-designed swale here. And over time, the water also infiltrates down and recharges deep aquifers too. So these kinds of swales look great to me. I know I got a lot of people who are permy, and we'll talk about that frost issue in a second. Permy experts on this. I got to ask you a question. What do you think about, let's see, I got to shut this off. 1 second. What do you think about this swale? is this a picture of a swale working? I see water filling it. What do you think? Is this a swale that's working? It's a little bit of a trick question. Looks more like a canal. Yeah. You know, it was made as a swale. It's on very flat ground, and it's through, you know, an existing forest there, that was that was over the swale. Yeah, everything over the berm is dead looking. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It doesn't look like it's necessarily watering that all that well. So, but this is one of the things. I remember when I was a kid, a kinesiologist, a guy who called himself a kinesiologist, came to the farm and tried to sell my stepdad vitamin supplements. Yeah, and the way they did this, I don't know if you've ever seen this thing. And what they did is they had my dad hold out his arm, you know, and these shoulder muscles are not very heavy. Have you ever seen people do this? And these shoulder muscles are not very strong anyway, you know. So the other guy would then push down my dad's arm really easily. He said, "Look how weak you are. You're so weak. You can't try to hold your arm up." And he'd push his arm down. Of course, anyone can push somebody's arm down with these weak shoulder muscles up here, right? And then he said, "Now hold this vitamin supplement in your other hand, as your body will feel and sense that your body is missing this vitamin, and that'll make you strong. Now hold up your arm." And the guy was going there and trying to push his arm down and being like, "Oh, I can't do it. You're so strong now because you're holding the vitamins in your hand." What do you think? You know, and I think seeing that, you know, it can really help refine my BS detector as a kid. Now, that's kind of an old scam that was going through a lot of farm communities when I was growing up. It's kind of funny stuff. And, you know, I would not say that this is not what we're doing, not a similar thing. It's not like permaculturists are trying to scam people. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying it's, but when we see swales that are filled with water, it's not necessarily a sign that they're working or collecting water. Because, you know, it could be that when I made the swale, it could be that if I hadn't made the swale, all the water would have infiltrated into the ground. But when I did the swale, I came through and used heavy equipment and compacted the soil, and now it's bare soil. And by the way, grassland ecologies, as we'll see later in the class when we use our swale calculator, can infiltrate maybe 30–40% of the water that falls on them. They have a really high infiltration rate. And with trees and grasses that are like not mown grasses especially, it can be, you know, 80% or higher. And real forests will have around 100% infiltration rate all the time. So if you go into a forest, it's pretty rare unless the soil has been compacted and see, like, you know, vernal pools just sitting there, because all the water infiltrates, because that's what forests do. They suck up the water. So in a lot of cases, you know, what may be happening here is that the swale is actually compacted soil, and it's bare soil, and bare soil can have infiltration rates that are as low as concrete. So basically, this is like a concrete pool, you know, and it's filled with water. We don't necessarily know that it's working well just because it's holding water. And that's one of the things I like to say. A lot of times, if the swale is working well, this is ironic, when the swale is really working well, they stop filling with water. So a lot of times people will build permaculture swales in the first couple of years. They'll see them filling with water and they're like, "Yeah, the swale is awesome." And then a few years later, they're no longer filling with water. And I've heard people actually, and seen people post online saying, "Why isn't my swale working anymore? It's not filled with water anymore." No, it's actually working now. That's the way it's supposed to do. Now plants have come in, the soil is recuperated from the machinery, and now it's really working. The water is now finally really getting into the soil the way it should be. So, so just a thing to keep in mind. Maybe a little controversial to some permaculturists. So we're gonna talk about some of the problems and issues with swales. We already talked about the potential for these areas in the swale to become frost issues, right? They can become a frost problem. Well, if we're looking at this, you know, we can be mindful of whether there's a frost problem or whether there's not. You know, like in this example, we can see the frost would come through and settle here, which means that, you know, this area might frost very easily. But up here on top of the berm, this area, oh, I can't change the color. This area might stay really great. And so this area might actually prevent frost. So we can be mindful of it, but we do need to be mindful of it. We could be creating an issue that creates more frost. And in the last class, we talked about frost channels. If you do swales and you have 100% swales across the property, you don't have frost channels. So you might end up with a lot more frost risk. If you're doing all your paths on contour, you'll have more frost risk than if you didn't have the swales on contour. But all the same, we do need to work about getting the design right, and there are some potential problems with them. I want to talk about one more before we talk just about a few more patterns. Oh, stop. Let me change this. I appear to be having a technical difficulty. I'm going to close that for just a second, and we'll try again. So another issue with swales is that when they're not done exactly right, we can, you know what, actually, we're going to come back after the class and we're going to talk about some of the potential problems for swales. You know, just to do one as an example, if we do a swale that's too deep, you see what happens in this picture. All of the water ends up at the bottom of the swale too deep to actually irrigate the soil in the berm. So with really deep swales, sometimes all the water soaks through down into a deeper soil level, and that ends up leaving, so the water all soaks down here, right? And that means that this area up here is a very dry zone, and all up here can be a very dry zone too. And then right here can be super saturated. And so this little bit right here will kill the plants because it's too wet and those red spots are too dry, and we've completely destroyed our landscape hydrology. There's a really famous project in Australia that has been kind of quiet about it. They've kind of talked about this a little bit in PDCs. I really wish they'd be more public about this. They ran a bunch of swales that were too deep. They penetrated the clay layer underneath the subsoil layer. So all the water soaked down into the deeper layers of soil, and they basically turned it into a desert. They turned their site into a desert. And they actually had to come through and do some very intensive site surgery to be able to recreate their landscape hydrology. So there are potential problems with them. They can be extremely powerful, amazing water catchment features, but we want to make sure that we're getting them right. So we'll talk about how to get them right in the second half of class. Just seeing if anyone has any questions again about that, because that's kind of controversial. We'll watch and we'll look at some videos about how water moves in landscapes, and actually you know, start to get an understanding for how these things can really work and how they really need to be designed. Feel free to ask any questions in chat if you like, or I'm checking the chat. Okay, yeah, just so what's this thing? I have to say, I've got art of it on the wall. Let's see, where am I at? So here's my art of this thing. I don't know if you can see that, but on my wall I have art of this concept. Nurse log, yes, the magic of nurse logs. So what you're looking at is a concept from ecology where logs are one of nature's best water storage devices and water harvesting devices. So a lot of times in nature, what will happen is an early tree will get established, a pine, we call them pioneer trees. It will die and fall down. And that contact with the soil becomes like a super motel for fungi and a super source of carbon. And the fungi and the dead tree and the other organisms that the tree hosts become a super sponge for water and water infiltration and holding the water next to it. So you could find a place where you have like 3 months of drought, and you could do this next summer, this summer, upcoming summer. You go out when it's been really hot and dry, and you go into a forest and you find these old fallen logs. And even if it's been like, 99 degrees for 2 weeks and there hasn't been any rain, you get underneath one of these fallen logs in the forest and it's still cool and it's still wet and damp because of the magic of this nurse log idea. So what we found is naturally, as you see in the picture, new plants, especially plants that require more water, piggyback onto these nurse logs, and the nurse logs can host these. And we've even discovered now that this was a major way that the Amazon food forest, the Amazon rainforest is really a big food forest. And we know now that for thousands of years, it was intentionally practiced that the native people of the Amazon would use these logs and lay them out like this and actually plant their food forest next to these nurse logs, because they observed this. They saw that kind of thing going on. They were like, hey, that looks like something smart people would do. And so they did it. So a very cool technique. If you like the idea of a swale, if right now you're thinking, gee, swales seem really cool. You get to water your crops for free and help establish tree systems using swales. This is something, this is what Bill Molson called passive swaling. Maybe you can't afford the equipment to run big swales. Maybe you don't have the resources to dig them all. If you put nurse logs on contour, and the scientific name for this is called LEBs, which is log erosion barriers. There's a whole big research literature on these. They work amazingly well. So then what happens is as the water flows down the hill, it comes into contact with this nurse log and kind of pools behind it a little bit, because as it slows down, particles, especially silts and clays, wash out of that. And so as you see on the right, the soil behind the nurse logs end up extremely rich. They end up extremely rich. And so over time, and the water has to sink down into the soil and flow. So over time, it builds up to the point right here where you actually have like a little, at first it'll be, a little swale. And as it fills in, it'll become like a full terrace. And it really happens quickly on a lot of soils. 2 or 3 years, you get log erosion barriers set out, and they become swales, and they become terraces, and you never had to dig. The magic of these log erosion barriers is that they've been found to work so well that they actually help trees establish better than like using full mulch. So if I wanted to establish trees, one of the best things we know we can do is mulch around the trees, right? Or you can just throw a big log down on there. And it turns out in research, side-by-side comparisons of trees that have been mulched completely with wood chips and trees where somebody just threw down a log there, like a lazy mofo, that the lazy log mofo guy tree actually wins and beats the mulch tree. So these are, and they've been found to dramatically reduce erosion, pretty much eliminate erosion after forest fires, and infiltrate huge amounts of water. So this is one technique we can use on almost any site, so long as you have access to wood as a resource. And these are some of the how it looked in establishment at Lily House, by the way. And a lot of these are kind of fishtail swales, not exactly 100% on contour, but set up so that every place in the yard can catch and infiltrate its own water as we go. And like here's another place where you can see as the terrace is built up from the soil, I actually had to add on new logs because it was no longer like a swale. It ends up being like a terrace. So to keep it functioning really well, you actually have to continue to build these up. So these nurse log erosion barriers, or LEBs, work just fantastically well, and a great technique for swaling in any place. I kind of think, well, let me just keep going on just a couple more. Everybody recognizes terraces. We'll talk a little bit, used all over the world. We'll talk a little bit about how they're used. Of course, we can just on contour again. The permaculture mantra for all this is always, our idea is to slow water down, spread it out, and soak it in. So let's look at this. Here we have a traditional farm field, and the farm field was tilled down the hill. What do you think about this design? What's happening with the water here? Well, the picture is standing at the top of the hill, looking at the trenches running down the hill. What do you think? I think the water falling up here is just going to go straight down, right? It's going to roll right down the hill there. And this area on the top of the hill is all going to be completely dry and toast. And these plants, if they're not irrigated, they're probably going to die or be extremely water stressed. And then at the bottom here, this is all going to be just flooded. And so, unless they're lucky, yeah, and not to mention the erosion, right? So all of this water is just going to take this. And this is so common. As you drive around farm country, as you drive around, I would say still 90% of the time, and there's a good historic reason why, but people have not thought about the water at all. And they just till, and they till usually on the longest angle away from the house. And because roads tended to be ran on contour, so it was easier to make the roads, the long angles against the roads were usually downhill. And people went back and forth from the house, which meant they were always tilling, just like in this picture, up and down the hills. So, so this is really common. Probably more often than not, farmland is tilled to cause erosion and cause both flooding and drought. So this makes no sense. But clearly what we want to do is take this water and spread it out this way, right? And slow it down and soak it into the soil so it's not creating erosion, not creating flooding, and not creating drought. So by the way, we're going to take a break in a second. We'll talk about one or two more. So another really easy thing we can get people to do on, right, this is not moving on here. I'm having another technical difficulty. Another thing that we can do is just have people change the direction that they are tilling in. Try to open up that one more time. So we call that contour plowing or contour tilling. If people are going to till, at least getting people to till on contour, like this is a picture I took in Iowa. where they had largely done strips of different crops so that there were natural barriers to soak in the water, and the tilling was not perfectly on contour, but mostly on contour. So the water tends to get into the soil. And there's a lot of research on this as a technique, and it can, in a lot of climates, like in Iowa, where this picture was, I think the University of Iowa research on it found an improved yields by 1/3 because of using this technique. So pretty amazing. But this brings us to the last one, the last new pattern I want to talk about before we take a break. The ultimate water collection device that we have. The ultimate water collection device is not permaculture swales. We're pretty clever, us permaculturists, but we didn't come up with the most clever water collection device. The most clever, ultimate water collection device is trees and tree systems in forest. As you may have catch me say earlier in class, generally speaking, forested areas in almost every climate infiltrate nearly 100% of water. Why? Because pretty much wherever there have been trees, trees have evolved to be able to catch and store and utilize as much possible water as falls on them. Over millennia, trees have evolved this superpower. So, the American Society of Landscape Architects and all of them, when they do calculations for different kinds of climates and ecosystems and how much water they infiltrate, if you see forest is considered to infiltrate about 100% of the water that falls on them. So, and as we said in our class on trees then make that water available to other plants in the ecosystem a lot of times. So this picture here in our class on forest systems, we talk about the Satoyama systems, forest systems in Japan. So this is one right here. So how clever were the Japanese? They put water harvesting systems up on the side of the hills and then put crop systems that required a lot of water to the downhill side of them, so that it was almost like the Japanese were building swales, only that worked even better than swales, up on the hillsides to irrigate their crops. Pretty cool systems. And we find systems like this around the world. So some facts about trees and water infiltration. Tree-covered soils in one study, I think all these were from a study by Penn State, had 4 times the infiltration of lawn on the same soils. Now, this was just from planting trees. So this isn't even like a full food forest or the Sanayama we were looking at. If you just take a tree, a landscape and plant apples and oaks, was I think what they did in this study, suddenly they had 4 times the infiltration of the water. So you want to solve all of these kinds of problems we're talking about, you want to deal with flooding, because flooding is largely from uninfiltrated water as well. Planting trees that are really good at soaking up and infiltrating water, planting forests can fix that problem for us and turn it into a resource. Even young trees infiltrated in the study 67% of the water that fell on them. That's 3-year-old trees in the study. So 3-year-old apples and oaks just planted basically into lawn were able to then turn that landscape into something that captured 67% of the water that fell on them. Which means, when we talk about things like swales and all these, really what we're trying to do is get past year 3. After year 3, our tree crops and tree systems and forests can fend for themselves. They can do this work for themselves after that. So forest soils, according to Penn State, can typically hold up to 18 inches of rain in most conditions. And there are studies from the Pacific Northwest from old growth forests where they can hold ludicrous amounts of rain. It's just amazing. And this is like in one rain event. So in an 18-inch rain event, which would be like, monsoon rains, forests can still often catch and store huge amounts of that water. Trees are pretty amazing. So a lot of times, this comes back to the waters. The E in waters is ecosystems. So creating healthy ecosystems is one of the best ways that we can manage water and create ecosystems that don't require water. So, it brings us to this idea of maybe this is the new old permaculture, is making sure that we're creating forest strips and tree zones to catch and infiltrate as much water as we possibly can. Just a few more tree facts before break. A single oak improves infiltration by up to 2.3 to 3.4 times in an area, according to one study. Many researchers have concluded that trees can be a highly effective method of stormwater control and management. So, a lot of times when we're talking about things like rain gardens and infiltration basins and all these sorts of things, one of our best things that we can get people to do, and it's a win all the way around for climate change, for food, and for water, is, trees. So we'll come back after a bit, and we're going to watch some videos of some really cool videos of water moving through the soil. If you joined us on Zach's channel, thank you so much for coming on in and playing around. I'd like to take questions from anyone for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll take a break at around 7:40, unless nobody has any questions. But it'd be a good time to check in and see. Sometimes the PDC can be so rich in this kind of information and patterns that we say it feels like you're holding a fire hose at people, which is a great water metaphor. So I'd like to take a second and check in and see if you have questions about any of these patterns we talk about. And of course, in the last part of class and into next class, we'll start to really talk about choosing these patterns. In what conditions do we want to use each of these ideas? Yeah, cool. I'm so glad you could join. I'm glad very glad to have you a lot around.
Okay, that's all we get for free. Um, the rest of it is Mike's I really hate that word, proprietary part of his class. He's going to be going to some of his stuff that he only gives access to his students about. So, but he was nice enough to let us sit in for the first half of the class, learn some great things. If you're new to the idea of earthworks and swales and water and stuff like that, then yeah, that was probably a lot of information to absorb. Um, John says, I saw pee and poop used in Germany. They had a catch bin for animal waste, and they collected the stalks and cuttings and then composted them. Yeah, and so you guys were talking a little bit in chat about using manure and stuff like that. Uh, and a good rule of thumb is that uh, for whatever manure it is, especially if it's human waste that you're dealing with, and human waste does need to be recycled into the soil. I mean, it can't just sit in a septic system and take those nutrients out of the system entirely. At some point, it does have to be recycled. So a good rule of thumb with any manure is to let it compost for a year. That way, you're sure that any pathogens have been dealt with. The microbes have just come in and taken care of it in one way or another. There are some shortcuts though that you can use to get around that. One of those is using black soldier flies, and black soldier flies they're a really interesting bug. They're endemic to the United States and North America, and I believe some other parts of the world too. But it's mostly areas like Tennessee and further south. And what they do is the adults are not like a housefly. They're not a pest in any way. Their mouth parts only are used for drinking water to keep themselves alive, and the entire rest of their goal is to mate and die if they're a male, or mate, lay eggs, and die if they're a female. And those eggs, once they sprout, the grubs that come out, or the maggots, if you will, are voracious eaters, and they will eat anything. Uh, I don't think we've gone through black soldier flies yet, but in one of the Permaculture 101 series, we will be looking at a video of the kind of eating that these larvae can do. They can go through bone, they can go through meat. Pretty much all the stuff that you've been told you can't put in a compost pile, black soldier flies can go through, and that includes manure and human waste. If you set the conditions right, I've been told, I've never seen this part in particular, but I've been told that they will eat waste, and they have very special gut. I don't know if it's the flora in their gut or what it is, but basically they destroy things like E. coli and other pathogens. And then at the end of it, once they're a big fat grub, what they do next is they look for a place to burrow so they can, pupate and then emerge as an adult. But kind of one of the interesting and beneficial things about that is if you were to say, a common setup is to have just a 5-gallon bucket like you'd use for, you see me like Home Depot or something like that. And you put all your compost into the bucket or your waste or whatever, and then you have a ramp that wraps around the inside of it all the way to the top. Now those grubs, once they've gorged themselves and they're ready to go pupate, will find that ramp and they will climb up themselves. And then you can direct them into a tube. And if you want to allow some of them to just, go off on their own and make the next generation, that's fine. But you can split it into a Y and then have a little collection thing where they will self-collect into this little thing, and you can do things like feed them to chickens or to fish or to other animals on your farm that eat insects, and it's perfectly healthy and safe food. It's very high in fat and protein. They're wonderful in many regards. So that's the way you can get through that a little bit faster. And the other way is to put your manure into a hot compost. And you got to be really careful about that too, because you want to make sure that the entire thing is getting above the danger zone. In food safety, the danger zone is between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and about 140 Fahrenheit. I think it's more like 135, but just 140 is easier to remember. So if you can get your pile just above 140, it's going to kill any pathogen that's in the manure. So you have to really be careful about probing all the different spots of it. Don't just assume because one area of the pile is hot that the entire thing is. But if you're mixing it up enough and managing that heat and keeping the heat high for long enough, you can have a safe finished product too. So that's another way you can get through that. Wait to the danger zone. And so there's other ways too. There's what's known as a willow bog. I haven't seen this in action, but the basic concept is you have your basic outhouse, but instead of having any sort of man-made collection pit, it goes into the center of it goes into a pit basically where you have willows planted all around. And willows are some of the most voracious trees. I've heard it described as they will basically just stick a straw into that poop and suck it right up. They're very heavy, hungry eaters, which is one of the reasons you got to be careful about where you plant willows, is because they will find any water source and any nutrient source that they can get their little tendrils into. They've been known to break into water pipes and sewer pipes and stuff like that. So you got to be careful about that. But if you put them in the right place, you can use them at least for part of the year. I don't know if it works through winter, but at least in the growing season, you can use them as a willow bog. So there's another option for you. There's also green machines, which have it's a similar principle to both the willow bog and using black soldier flies, putting those together, using various chambers and various microbes and living things to break down that waste faster than it would if you just piled it up somewhere. So there's that thing too. There's all kinds of really cool things that could be implemented to take care of human waste. But that that's a little bit of a tangent, not quite what the topic was tonight, but that's all right. As you can see, I love talking about this sort of thing. So tonight's topic was more about water, and Timmers, you kept bringing up the point that you were concerned about frost traps, and especially when you're using a swale. And for those that don't know, a swale is just a long ditch. And usually in permaculture, you're putting that on contour. So if you've ever seen a contour map, each of those concentric circles or lines or whatever, uh, those would be all at the same elevation. So you would put your ditch all along that same elevation so that all the water that comes to that point is collected. And so remember, it's collect, spread, and sink. So that's the idea in permaculture, because then it's the catch and store energy principle. So we're taking the energy of that water, and instead of just allowing it to run straight down the hill, we're catching it and we're storing it in the soil itself. And as it moves through the soil, it goes much slower. And as Mike was pointing out there, you don't want to have your trench too deep, or the point that it's infiltrating is going to be too low in the soil gradient. So say you have your slope that goes down, and your ditch is really super deep. Say you really go all out. You get a backhoe in, you get a 6 foot deep trench there. That water is going to infiltrate mostly 6 feet down, and then it's going to move basically parallel to the surface of the soil along the ground, or underneath the ground, that is. 6 feet down is way too deep for most roots. Only trees are going to be able to get to that point, and even then, not all trees are going to penetrate that deeply. So you want to, have it just deep enough that as it's going down through the soil, moving its way through the soil, it can still reach that root level, right? So there's that point of it, but then also the frost traps. The main okay, so that's where I was going with that. So a problem that people can run into is that as cold air, especially in the morning, is starting to sink down into off of the landscape, it can pool up in these swales, in these trenches, and that can be a problem. It's mostly a problem for flowering plants. So that's going to be the tender part, the most tender growing part of a plant, where especially like fruit trees and certain berry bushes, if those delicate flowers are exposed to frost, they might die. It's not going to kill the plant necessarily, but it's going to make a much lower yield. So if you have some early flowering stuff where there's still a danger of frost, I know in Minnesota, the rule of thumb is May 15th. That's going to be our first guaranteed frost-free day. So if you have stuff that flowers after May 15th, you really don't even have to worry about that. Because if you think about it, any of the plants that you're putting on your landscape are going to be hardy to your area. So they're going to be able to survive freezing and thawing, right? So the only time that it really matters is if it's affecting fruit production. Now you might have some plants that are coming out with, their tender leaf buds and stuff like that, and they might be sensitive to frost, but it's not going to kill the plant. They'll at worst they'll drop those buds and make some new ones. It's usually not going to be a big deal. Peppers are hard here, or are you trying to say hardy or hard? Not sure on that. So with your annual vegetables, the ones that you would put in your veggie garden, your peppers, your tomatoes, hard to grow. So when we're talking about annual vegetables, peppers, tomatoes, peas, not actually carrots. Carrots are more, they're kind of in between perennial and annual. It's called a biennial. But most of the stuff you'd see in a produce stand, those are not going to be things you want to grow on your swale, probably, because they're going to take the most time tending to. And generally swales and big earthworks like that are not going to be in your zone 1. And if you remember that Mike's map, zone 1 is basically the area around your house. Now, Bill Mollison put it like your zone 1 should be that when you go out and collect your morning herbs or your morning salad or whatever, that you can get you can get to the plants, harvest them, and get back inside without getting your socks wet. So really close to the house. And that's where you're going to want to keep most of your annuals because they're going to take the most work. They're going to be some of the most cultivated things that you grow. So humans aren't always the best in selecting genes. They may select for things like flavor or color or transport. I mean, there's a reason that the Red Delicious is the most popular apple in the United States, and it's not because anyone thinks it tastes good. It's because it's hard as a rock, and it will transport and keep much longer than any other apple. So there's always give and take when you're selecting for genes. And if you're not careful, you can breed out things like hardiness and adaptability and these sorts of things. And that's often what has happened with the most cultivated fruits and vegetables. So that's why you want to keep them up by your house. And just annuals in general need more work. You have to spend time sowing the seed and sometimes digging them in. With perennials, it's mostly just set and forget. And then once in a while, you tend to. You cut it back, you harvest it, stuff like that. That's why most permaculture systems prefer overwhelmingly perennials. Even when it comes to things like grain, because you can get grain from nuts, you can get grain from acorns. It doesn't have to come from wheat or oats or other really intensive, hard to do on a permaculture system plants, because they're mostly annuals and mostly to get enough of them, you have to do kind of a monoculture. Rice is a little bit of a different one because it's a semi-aquatic plant, so you can grow other things alongside it. You can grow fish alongside with it. So it's a little bit more versatile. But most of the other grains are going to be difficult to do in a permaculture setting. And because most of the time you need heavy machinery. And one of the big goals, at least as where I'm coming from, is to avoid as much machinery as possible, because then you're getting dependent on stuff that can be hard to fix and take a lot of money. And what if, at some point gas prices rise or diesel prices rise to the point where you can no longer afford it? And here you've been doing it for the last 20 years. You don't really have another system in place to take over. It just seems like the most risky of strategies to depend heavily on heavy machinery. So yeah, look to other things when you're thinking about getting your grain. Let's see what other comments are coming in here. Oh, it just gets a little too cold for the peppers. Well, maybe you're putting them out a little too early. I don't know. I don't actually know where you're at. Did you say? I seem to remember you saying you're in Oregon. Is that right, Timmers? Because if you're in Oregon, if you're in a higher zone, you shouldn't have a problem with peppers. It may be just a matter of where they're being placed too. Like if you're finding that it's getting too, yeah, Oregon. So if you're finding that it's getting too cold for them, maybe they're just in the wrong side of the house. Maybe you want to have it more on the south side of the house or the west side where it's going to get the hottest and it's going to support it a little more. Peppers do like the heat a little bit more. So that could be. You love growing cucumbers and squash. Always so nice. Yeah. Melons. Melons can be difficult, especially things like watermelons that need a lot of heat and a lot of water to really get to a nice size. Corn is the thing that's always been the biggest struggle for me. The biggest ear of corn has been, a little 6-inch guy with, I barely get a few kernels off of it. But corn's a really heavy feeder. I've even tried doing it with the Three Sisters and did a little better. But it's just one of those ones that doesn't work for me. And that you may find that too. It seems like every gardener has one kind of plant that for whatever reason just doesn't work with them. See, yeah, grow corn like a mofo there. How you tried with the black plastic and stuff? Well, I would say do more observation. And really pay attention to the planting times. Sometimes on the back of seed packets, it will even have different planting times for different zones. So pay attention to that as well. Maybe it is you're just planting too early. maybe peppers just don't grow well in the Pacific Northwest. I don't actually know. I don't actually know. Most peppers are from, the Mesoamerica into South America. So maybe that's more where they're suited to, and they don't like it there, and too much wet and gloom could be. I don't really know the answer to that one. Corn, herbs, and veggies do well. Well, that's cool. So anyway, back to the idea of frost pockets. So if you're really finding that there's a problem with a frost pocket, yeah, you can do more level terraces as opposed to the ditch and berm system. So you have the ditch or the swale, and then you have the mound of earth next to it. So maybe more of a level one. So that's still, you have your water coming down the hill. Let me get my hand up. You have your water coming down the hill. If it's hitting this flat plane here, it's still going to lose some of its momentum, and it's still going to pool up a little bit. You could even pitch back the terrace just a little bit, like a degree or two, and you can catch a lot of water that way still. Um, and you may find, if you're in a really hilly area, that terraces are the only solution to actually having usable land. There's some really great photos I've seen. Let me pull it up because it is really amazing. But the stuff that they've done in like China. Um, let's look at, oh God, some of these are just amazing. I'll share the screen with you right now so you can take a look. But it's just phenomenal, some of the things that these Chinese farmers have done. Let's take a look at this one in particular. Oh, look at that. You can literally see the contour lines because that's where the rice paddies are formed. So this is a system of not only using terraces, but then there's a little bit of a dip. There's a basin within each of these terraces. And, oh, I shared the wrong one. Or it didn't go in there. Oh, that's weird. This is the one I'm sharing. Okay. So yeah, within each of these terraces here, it's a basin, and that's where you grow your rice. And then they often have cattle that they'll use to help plow the rice paddies. Cattle adds manure directly to it. You can grow fish in there as well. It's an amazing system, and it's a really sturdy system. Some of these terraces have been around hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. It's just really cool. The extent to which they can do that, pretty cool. Yeah, rice really does need water a lot. Yeah, and that's the other great one in terms of water management is chinampas, pioneered or perfected mostly by the Aztecs. Oh, I don't want to open up a new tab though. I just want to go to the site. Yeah. Anyway, you can see on the side here. Chinampas. We did a video on that one, not, a couple months ago. But the idea here is you have these specialized trees that their roots grow very vertically down into the soil. So they act as your anchors. And then you set up logs to form your border. And then you fill the inside of the border with reeds and mud. Use layer upon layer upon layer. I should mention you start out in like a lake. And then eventually you have this man-made island, which is self-watering. The water wicks up through the reeds, self-fertilizing. The fertilizer comes through. You have all sorts of space to grow ducks and fish and all sorts of other stuff. It really just maximizes that edge. And the same is true of terraces and swales and berms on contour. All of it is also about maximizing edge. And one of the reasons that permaculturists often use that swale and then berm model is that you have a lot of different microclimates right all there all there together. So depending on which way you're facing, that berm might be high enough to shade the noonday sun, and you could shelter plants better. The top of that berm is always going to be the driest part, so you can put your most drought tolerant stuff on the top of the berm, and your most water loving stuff just a few feet away below. But the idea is to maximize that edge. So there's so many different things that you can plant all in the same area. And the nice thing about doing berms, especially with a wood core, or doing a lot like what Mike was talking about with the nurse logs. So if you have a core of wood that either the dirt just builds up over naturally, or you pile dirt over and make what's called a hugelkultur bed. The really cool thing about that is once that log breaks down, it acts like a sponge, and so it's very much a self-watering system at that point, because it'll just, any water that infiltrates, it'll suck it up into that sponge of decayed tree log, and then the roots that from your living plants will penetrate down into it and take up water as needed. The thing about the hugelkultur especially, though, is that because it's a whole lot of carbon, remember we've talked before about composting and how you need to balance your carbon and nitrogen ratio. Because with a hugelkultur you have a core that's all carbon, it tends to suck a lot of the nitrogen out of the soil. The way that you can mitigate that is by planting nitrogen fixing plants to begin with. So things like alfalfa, peas, other legumes mostly, and you just put as many as you can into that hugelkultur bed, and that'll also stabilize it at the same time, and help keep the erosion down. Especially things like alfalfa. Alfalfa is a wonderful nitrogen fixer. Its roots are super strong. It can literally break concrete apart, and they go up to 12 feet down into the soil. So if you really want to root some piece of land into place, plant alfalfa on top of it, at least to start with, until more bigger plants can come and take over. And at the same time, it's fixing that nitrogen. It's really cool. How do you spell squile? Squile. I don't know where you're seeing that word. Squile. Not sure about that one. So yeah, I think that's probably going to do it for tonight. It's getting on to 7 o'clock now. If there's any other questions. Squeal? Squeal. What is it in reference to? You got to give me more to go on. I'm not quite sure. Swale? Is that the word that you're thinking of? A swale is like a ditch. That it's just a long, skinny ditch. Is that what you're thinking? That's the only thing that's coming to mind. Swale. Okay, swale. Gotcha. Swale. Let's find a resource for that to pop in the chat there. This looks like a good one here. It's from Shades of Green Permaculture. So it talks about what contours are. Talks about the swale and berm method. It talks about how to find the level. Yeah, I haven't researched this. I haven't looked over this one too much, but just kind of skimming it. Looks like a good resource. So we'll put that up in the chat. Man, that's a really long. Jeez, that is a really long URL. They should really do something about that. So there's a resource on swales right there. It's such a long URL. They really got to figure their stuff out there. So they're talking about swales. Okay. Swale. Yeah, basically it's just a long ditch. And usually when we're talking about permaculture, it is on contour, so it's the same elevation throughout the whole thing. Yeah, any other questions before we hand it off to some other cool streamer? Let's see who's on right now. Hildebeest is on. I don't know if I've ever rated Hildebeest. That might be a good one. She's pretty cool. Oh, Comrade Bubbles is on. Oh, they're doing stream raiders. I'm not too interested in that one. That's kind of hit or miss. Let's see. Yeah, why don't we do Hildebeest? That'd be good. Looks like she's talking about politics. Oh, the convoy truckers and Karens. That sounds fun. Check out Hildebeest. It's another great streamer. Yeah, have a great night too, Timbers. Thanks for being such a great part of chat. Thank you all for joining me. We're going to go ahead and raid into Hildebeest then. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. And yeah, hope to see y'all Wednesday. We're going to be continuing on with Alexander Berkman's What is Communist Anarchism? Should be a good time. He's talking, the next chapter is going to be on his experience with the October Revolution, the Soviets' revolution. And I think this chapter in particular is the interim period between the first revolution against the Tsar and the final October push. I guess I don't know what the exact terminology is, but the final push that the Soviets made to take over Russia. So that should be a good time. Thank you very much to my Patreon supporters. I keep forgetting to mention this at the end of stuff, but I really should get in the habit of. So thanks very much to John T and Mike E for being Patreon supporters. I'll put that link up in the chat again if it hasn't come around recently. So here you go for Patreon. Oops. If you're interested in becoming a member, all it takes is $5 a month, and it helps keep this stuff going. You know, if someday I get enough patrons, then my goal is to be able to do well. First of all, I want to start doing PDCs, permaculture design courses, on this platform here, because no one else is doing that yet. I would be the first, so I think it's going to put it out to a whole lot of potential new people. But once I get that going, my ultimate goal is to get enough Patreon supporters and supporters through Twitch or whatever that I can just give away PDC courses for free, and that people can just sign up. And, you know, I'll still have to limit how many people I can handle, because I'm going to be doing things like, you know, assessing homework and conferring certificates and all that sort of thing. But more or less, it'll still be free to those people, and it'll be free for everyone to watch. That's definitely the goal, no matter what, is to put all the information out for free. It's just that in order to get a permaculture design certificate and to have access to myself for questions at any time, and be able to come on to the chat during the actual courses, that would be for the paying PDC members. But everyone else still gets to watch in. That's my goal right now. But long term, yeah, it'd be great if I could get a stable enough source of income through doing the streaming stuff that I could just give away permaculture design certificate courses for free, or free to the end user, supported by all of you. But anyway, let's start the raid now, and I'll see you all Wednesday.